Well, good morning, everybody. First thing I want to start off with is some of the weekend model trends as we begin this new forecasting week. And if you remember last week, one of the discussions we had was how the artificial intelligence forecast model was quite wet in this area compared to other models. Nearly all of the other weather forecast models were wetter on the southern side of this, but not quite as wet coming out of Nebraska to northern Missouri, parts of Kansas, Iowa, Illinois, and actually over into the Ohio River Valley, which needs quite a bit of precipitation. Most of the models did properly find this drier spot down in Texas, although weekend rains right in through this area were critical. They even got into early this morning into parts of Oklahoma. The risk of being drier down in parts of the southeast, a lot of folks down here would need that forecast given how much rain we saw from Debbie last week. But the presence of deeper troughs in the western United States has changed the precip pattern there, and we see a lot of this collecting at times into the northeast or around the Great Lakes. We're going to come back to this next potential tropical cyclone called potential tropical cyclone number 5 in just a few moments, but I want to show you that the ensembles have picked up on this pattern as well. So just take note of the increases in these two areas compared to what we were looking at last week. This was kind of the thinking we had in the forecast, even though it wasn't showing up very well in the model simulations. Okay, more on other parts of the country in a few moments, but I want to show you what the latest update is on potential tropical cyclone number 5. So this is just a track total density plot, and what we're looking at here is did verify from what we were concerned about last week, which was that the Bermuda High we thought would stretch out a bit more toward the Azores or over toward Africa, allowing this system to stay out in open ocean. And then you combine that with the way that there'll be troughing over the northeast, and it's just a better scenario for keeping this storm system out to open ocean. So that was an important trend as well. And then I think the last thing we're just going to have to talk about is over these next 10 days to 2 weeks, what does the temperature pattern really start to do? Do we get warm air to replace what for most of the next, several days here is going to be some cooler air in the midsection of the country and into the northeast, while so much heat stays anchored in the southern plains? Cooler weather along the west coast. That seems to be the channel through which we've kind of settled in this pattern. And unfortunately, as that happens, we are going to see some very high evaporation rates down in our southern plains, especially Texas and Oklahoma, making those rains that came through this morning so important. So let's go and have a look at that. This is just a radar animation starting late last night and running through early this morning. We can watch these storms that came out right here into parts of Oklahoma, into Arkansas early this morning, but also take note of what's coming through Missouri and into Illinois, into Iowa. It'll eventually get into Illinois. But what we're watching in this area is some much needed rain hitting some really dry areas. Now, it did not hit all of the areas that needed this precipitation, but we need to keep an eye on this. Other than that, we do have some scattered rain that's moving through parts of the Carolinas after the tremendous amount of rain that they received last week. I'll show you that map in a few moments. And we see some scattered storms from last night still persisting into this morning that are around the Four Corners states and the Four Corners Ridge that's been here for a while, part of the southwest monsoon. All right, from here, let's take a look at these new precip stats. Now, these are valid through yesterday morning, not this morning, but on Sunday morning, and it is the last 30 days of total accumulated precipitation. So now you can see why getting that rain into this area this morning and here was so critical given how dry they are. But there are several areas surrounding that need quite a bit more precipitation. And I wanted to take a closer look at a few of these areas on the map, beginning with the southern plains. So we can see that numerous spots here in parts of Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, over toward, the mid-south, and then stretching backward or westward, toward Kansas, through Missouri into this part of Iowa and Nebraska. Many places over the last 30 days receiving, like a fifth or less of their normal precipitation. The heavier precipitation seems to be kind of hitting the sides of these very dry regions rather than going through them. So that rain this morning is quite critical. Just going a bit farther north here, this is the kind of my north central view on our maps. And again, through central Minnesota, Wisconsin, a stripe out of central Iowa and Illinois, parts of Kentucky, western Kentucky is a bit dry, but the rest of it's doing pretty good on precipitation. And overall, that's a pretty quick divide between who's had the rain and who's not had the rain. And we do know who the big areas that's had the rain, and that's in parts of the southeast. So once we include Debbie's precipitation and put it on the monthly time scale, we have several places in here that are 300 to 400% of normal precipitation. That's 3 to 4 times. And the rainfall that hit the southeast last week was pretty devastating. We've only got a few more weeks where we'll be looking at maps like this. I'm nearly finished with all of the code to build the new website, and I'm looking forward to getting that out. But as you can see here, my original color bar only goes up to 10 inches, and we went way over that in areas here. Some places picking up 15 to almost 20 inches of rainfall. Heavier rains did spread through and hit those very dry places in Virginia and West Virginia, although there is a pocket still here. We'll look at this in soil moisture in a few moments. That is in the Ohio basin that needs quite a bit more, and that gets into Ohio, West Virginia, even parts of Pennsylvania that still need more despite the rainfall that came through there and eventually made it into the Northeast. As I talked about earlier, the rains this past week that did get into this part of Oklahoma and Texas coming out of Colorado. I mean, this hit some key cotton acres up here. Desperately needed that precipitation, and we did get rain. Remember last week that came through parts of central Kansas. But there are stripes that were missed, and these are part of those stripes that are very, very dry. Large storms in the front range of the Rockies. And again, we talked a lot about the heavy rain and the severe weather that came through here in last week's briefings. So let's just think this through and kind of understand, I think, where the pattern's going to go, because the way things have shaped up as we get toward, this kind of almost second week of August, have been just a lot of cool air driven into the central part of North America. And I've been trying to make a case as to why, we saw this shifting around. And I think it had a lot to do with tropical systems, with here and in the Pacific, some shifting around of the Madden-Julian oscillation, and just some overall kind of changes in the temperature pattern in the North Pacific, which were, again, reflective of what was going on with the wind pattern and the pressure pattern. But there's no doubt this morning, a little after 6 as I was recording this, we had plenty of cool air that was still rolling through the upper Midwest into the eastern Corn Belt and the Ohio River Valley. Like last week, we talked about the really cold air that got into parts of western North Dakota. Another morning here in the 40s and 50s, but still very hot across the southern tier of the United States. And thinking about those temperatures, I want to take you back to a global ocean temperature map. These sea surface temperature anomalies. This is one of the areas of largest change over the last week. And it's quite reflective of the way that the pressure patterns across North America have evolved. We've allowed a lot more sunshine in through here, and there's some it's downwelling. We're getting more hot heat into the upper ocean in this area, and it's really showing up well on satellite. So we're kind of back to 3 epicenters of heat again. Now, if you remember back, in July when we started to have this discussion about what those 3, epicenters were doing, it really changed the temperature pattern and precipitation pattern across the U.S. And we're going to see maybe a bit of a repeat of that as we go forward, because we're not getting much out of La Nina and its influence right now. And even though the MJO is moving, I have a feeling that the MJO movement is going to have more of an impact in late August on the tropical season than anything else. So with all of that as kind of a backstory, I just want to take you here. Where are we going to be for most of the next 15 days? And this is what we're seeing. And more ridging coming in here. And so if the atmosphere is going over this ridge, it's going to be driving itself into a trough here. And I have to ask, how long are we going to be able to sustain larger ridges in the central United States while there's troughs kind of flanking the Northeast and the Northwest? What I'm saying here is that if you remember back into early summer, I had concerns that the jet stream was not just going to retreat north, but get very weak and stay there. And we really haven't seen that. It's kept its momentum at times, especially in the North Atlantic, south of this trough and north of this ridge. And what I'm saying here is, while we will have heat in the southern plains, will we be able to get really high amplitude ridges that come up in the mid part of North America to deliver a lot of heat while we have these troughs that kind of flank either side of the United States? The artificial intelligence has kind of keyed into this pattern at the end of last week, and it's kept it over the weekend. And that's what I want to see and compare that to the new European ensemble. So let's look at this pattern. All right, so this is through midday today on Monday. We play out there through Tuesday and Wednesday of this week, work our way toward the end of the week. And I just continue to see stuff like this. And this is potential tropical cyclone number 5. So this week, where we're keeping heat will largely be across the southern tier of the United States. Now into next weekend and beyond, the models are attempting to push a ridge out of Texas and New Mexico in and along the front range of the Rockies, and even extend this clear up into almost the Canadian archipelago as we get a bit more amplitude out of these 2 troughs. So heat, I do expect some heat to be coming back and out of the Great Basin over the Continental Divide and into the Central Plains of the United States, and Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, possibly open that up more into the Midwest. Now, when we see a pattern like this, where there's a ridge here, we would expect as we go into week 2, this whole area with flow coming out of the northwest, but going into a trough. Okay, do you see the difference here? I know we always say northwest flow, northwest flow. Okay, northwest flow is only fruitful in terms of making storms when you have a larger ridge here. You get little troughs that sneak around it like this that come through and deliver the precipitation. When we get out into week 2, now again, week 2, because there's a trough that's bringing in northwest flow, this area tends to be drier and it tends to not generate storms. So what I'm saying is we're going to go through a 7 or 8 day time period in this area where the rainfall is going to increase, and then the week 2 forecasts are going to look drier because of this, and the temperatures are likely going to start to come up as well. But not along the west coast and certainly not in the northeast as we stretch this out to about 10 days. So going back to our all hazards weather map, some dense fog this morning here, parts of the Central Plains, still quite hot in Oklahoma, right along the Red River Valley of the south. Got heat advisories in a few other places along the Gulf Coast and here in the southeast. Still have the flood issues that are going on here in North and South Carolina, and some red flag warning and some air quality issues still in parts of the Pacific Northwest. Today's risk on severe storms, just a few areas to keep an eye on. One here coming out of Utah toward the eastern end of the Snake River Valley. We then have the kind of the front range getting out into the high plains here of Colorado and surrounding areas. And then once again, the storms that we're going to have to keep an eye on in the Carolinas. Tomorrow, broader area here across the high plains, western plains, stretching all the way up to the southern Canadian prairie. And then you see that moving out. But at this point, each of these next 3 days, the kind of highest risk category that the Storm Prediction Center is putting out is a marginal risk. So if we just take a look at some radar data this morning, okay, we talked about this a few moments ago. I'm looking for initialization in the models, and so we're looking for the heavier rains here. That's coming through parts of Missouri and Iowa. Some of the storm activity that's over here and rain that's in North Carolina. So you're kind of seeing these things because I'm going to flip over now to the NAM. And, you know, at 6 to 7 o'clock, I think the model had a good initialization. So you remember last week I threw it out a couple times because I thought the initialization was terrible. So let's now use it. I think it's given us a better look. Okay, so this is through this morning. There's that rain coming right over the top of St. Louis. I'm actually heading to St. Louis for 3 days this week, a great conference down there. So I will be bringing my umbrella this afternoon. And you can see the storms, four corner states. Look at the storms in parts of the Northwest getting over the mountains here in Montana. And then risk tonight of those stronger storms, or this afternoon, this evening here in North Carolina, some scattered storms in the Northeast. As we play this into the evening hours, we're going to watch again. You saw it on the SPC map. Watch the high plains, the western plains right here in Colorado and surrounding areas for the risk of those big storms, and also possibly farther to the north in Montana, southern Alberta, and Saskatchewan. Then getting into Tuesday, it's Tuesday morning, afternoon, and evening. We do need to get this rain here a little bit farther to the south. I remember this past week we got better storms here, but we need to fill in a gap in Kansas farther to the south. And then playing this forward, this is 5 o'clock on Tuesday night. Look at the storms coming out here in the evening hours. This is where the Storm Prediction Center was watching that area tomorrow on Tuesday. And then we get into Wednesday, and there's more rain that's kind of pouring through parts of Iowa, coming out of Nebraska, but coming right through the central part of Missouri, one of the areas that I think has been best forecast for these rains from last week's model runs to this week's. So that gets us out there, pretty far. We're out to mid-Wednesday now. And if we take a look at areas that do need to get this precipitation, so storms coming out of Montana, great. Some storms in the western and high plains, yes. We need the rain in through this quarter. This is 16-inch or 40-centimeter soil moisture values. But we've got to get more of this into this mid-Mississippi, lower Mississippi, and Ohio River Valley to kind of fill in some of the gaps. We've got to get more of this rain back into Kansas and Oklahoma as well out of this pattern. So that's what we're needing to see in the models. Let's go ahead and have take a look at the 7-day forecasts and 10-day forecasts to kind of get an idea. So the WPC, remember last week, it had almost no rain forecast for Iowa, northern Illinois, Minnesota, Wisconsin. It was all in Missouri or coming out of Nebraska. And look at this. It's really moved itself more into this area for the heaviest rainfall in the next 7 days, keeping much of Texas over to the Mississippi River, even pockets of the southeast drier. So it's kind of a very Just important and interesting shift in the WPC. Now we can go back to the artificial intelligence. That's the 7-day forecast, and this is the 10. And again, 7 to 10, I see a lot of increased chances for precip coming out of Alberta and getting into Montana, also parts of the Pacific Northwest, and a very wet corridor right here in the central part of the United States, and also around the Great Lakes, Ontario, Quebec as well. This is the national blend of models, next 7 days. Got the heaviest rains right here in parts of Missouri, and then this takes us out there to 10 days. So you can see where it's added from day 7 to day 10 is primarily here in the northeast along the Appalachian Mountains, getting farther to the eastern Great Lakes into the northeast. If we go from there to the European model, that's the 7-day outlook from the European, this being the 10-day. And again, last week it did not have the heavy rain in this area, but it has since kind of moved into that region. But all of the models have kept this part of Texas quite dry, and that's a major concern going forward with that flashed out risk. And the last model I'm going to show you this morning would be the GFS. This is the 0Z GFS 7-day, and that is the 10-day. So 7 to 10. And again, you see that major increase here as the trough comes sweeping through and kind of lives over this part of Ontario, Quebec, and the northeast. Now, I want to talk for just a moment about the tropical system, because if you remember last week, it was the GFS, which was the model that was trying to push this next potential tropical system somewhere close to the United States, even maybe dragging it into the northeast. But it's right here when we get out in the forecast maps. And as we play this forward, we'll watch by Thursday into Friday for that system to just get pulled to the north. And what you're going to notice is there's a low here. The Bermuda high is much closer to Europe and Africa, and this is going to have to settle in between both of those. That'll be where the broader steering current is. But you'll see it kind of meander around quite a bit. It's not got this like perfect path because that's kind of some weaker flow in that area. But we can't deny that this large trough and the fact that the Bermuda high is east is what's protecting the United States from having this system come in. And I'm just showing you the GFS as one example. The European has got something quite similar to that, which you saw at the very beginning of my slides when we were just looking out there to see where all of the model ensemble probabilities were keeping this potential tropical cyclone. Okay, so from here, let's go and have just a quick comparison between the models. So GFS on the left, European on the right. As we play forward there, you can see that rain in the middle part of the country. You can see the scattered showers in the east and southeast. We then get into Tuesday and Wednesday, and that area kind of continues to get hit with more and more precipitation as higher pressure early in the week sits over the Great Lakes. We then go toward the end of the week, and that pressure pattern flips. So going into Friday and Saturday, now there's a deeper low that's sitting in this area. That's where the GFS has the system. Europeans much farther to the north already with it. But again, largely staying out to open ocean because of the deeper trough of low pressure that we're going to see develop mid to late week, and it's going to sit in this area over the weekend. We can also see low spinning off of the the northwest coast. That could be bringing in some cloud cover and some precip there as well. But overall, as it stands, this pattern is set up to where we're going to have troughs kind of flanking the United States, one on each side. And that's, I think, going to be the large part of the pattern going forward. So at the beginning of this, I showed you the wetter areas. Now I want to focus in on those drier areas. So the probability of staying under 1/10 of an inch is highest in Mexico, Texas, along the Red River Valley over toward the Mississippi Valley, and then in our southwest. We have seen this area decrease in parts of the Pacific Northwest and Montana as we look at some of the new forecast data. So we've looked at those wet areas. Here's what the dry areas look like. Out into week 2, the models really reflect that pattern we mentioned. So doing something like this. So with troughs kind of on either side, that northwest flow is not going to result in wetter conditions out into week 2. It's not bone dry, but it's just not the type of northwest flow that initiates big storms. And again, this is week 2, not the current week we're in right now. This is next week when we're talking. I will be watching all week to see if anything shifts around this pattern to affect that. But at this point, I think this is a pretty robust forecast, and the CPC has picked up on that as well. So that brings us to a discussion about temperatures. And while we were very hot across the south, look at the cooler air that invaded on the 9th and the 10th and the 11th, showing you these areas that these weather stations that either were approaching record low temperatures, and some of them got pretty close to them. A lot of cool air that was in place. And as we look out there over the next 7 days, just have a look at these temperatures today. Cool West Coast. The heat is all down here in Texas and New Mexico and parts of Oklahoma, across Louisiana into the southeast United States, while much cooler air still sits and this broad section of the United States right here. That's Tuesday, and there's a 30-degree swing in temperatures here, at least 20, approaching 30 degrees in places from the southern plains to the Midwest. West Coast, nice, cool week compared to what you can get this time of year. That's Wednesday's temperatures getting into Thursday, Friday, getting out here toward the weekend. That's Saturday and Sunday. And overall, for most of the country, except this pocket down here in the southern plains and at times into the southeast, we're going to be seeing near normal temperatures for nearly everywhere else. So looking out there day 5 through 10, this is from the GFS. We'll take a look at the European in a few moments. Still cooler here. That would be when the trough settles in late this week and sets up in the northeast, Ontario and Quebec, and moves in this direction. You have a trough that's coming in the west, keeping it cool there as well. So in the middle, there's this ridge. And some of the forecasts are attempting to open that ridge up, into a broader part of North America. And for the last several weeks, every time the models have done this, they've been way too aggressive early and they've backed off late. So we're going to watch to see if that happens again in this case. But at this point, I actually think there is better evidence that this is going to occur given the heat that's come into the North Pacific lately. So we could get some hotter days back into the central plains of the United States, getting into the western Corn Belt soon. But a big section of the country looking at near normal temperatures with no longer the excessive heat living in the western United States. And the European model sees the same thing. That's day 5 through 10. And this is day 10 through 15. And it's got that same look to it. So there's a couple of cooler spots compared to what they could be this time of year, and the ridge that kind of sits in the middle. I like that. That seems to be quite a bit of consistency. Last Friday, the Climate Prediction Center did release its new outlook for the last week of August and the first week of September. And you've got it here, which really kind of reflects, I think, the pattern we're currently in. What I would just be wary of is seeing a drier forecast for this area. We have found more often than not that storms have been able to get into this region despite drier forecasts, and they've even been able to get farther into the south here. We've been able to get them out of Nebraska toward Oklahoma, toward eastern Oklahoma as of late. But I do think that the hottest temperatures and the driest conditions are likely going to be anchored a bit farther to the south. But this looks out there to that first week of September. We're out pretty far, and everyone, all of us, are concerned about what will happen in the Gulf of Mexico when we get out to that point. And that's going to be an interesting thing to watch because some of the longer range models have looked all the way out there to mid-September, and what we've got here is this: the dropping of pressure in this area, the placement of a larger ridge in the North Pacific, and the Bermuda High is still doing its thing. So what we have to think about here is what this could be doing to set up the pressure pattern and the precipitation pattern across the United States. We'll zoom in and look at that. Again, this is just model data. And we see that overall, if there's a drier region, it seems to be in the south. It's wetter in this part of the Canadian Prairie, wetter in the northeast. I just want to make a point that there is a large section of the country that continues to get forecast wetter, and it ends up not verifying at all. There's been pockets of heavy rain that have gotten through this many times. Now, that doesn't mean everybody, as you saw in the precip maps I showed at the beginning. And then I have to say, there's no possible way the model could really hone in on this properly. And the reason why is we do expect the tropical season to get going and really get going. And so some evidence of that is kind of seen here. When we see the progression of the MJO, which we're going to follow as these darkest colors here, it's kind of coming out of phase 2 toward phase 3 and phase 4. I was reminded this weekend by a colleague about that progression and what it might mean for the Atlantic, because when we get the MJO to slide through the Indian Ocean toward phase 4, this suppression moves with it, and it tends to unlock after this goes through, which would be about from now through the 21st. This tends to pass out of the Atlantic, and when the MJO gets to phase 4, we tend to open the Atlantic, suggesting that maybe the 23rd, 24th, 25th, maybe all the way out to the 27th, 28th, that's going to be the time frame that we're expecting the Atlantic to really get going again. And that will be when the MJO kind of sweeps over through the Indian Ocean and maybe ends up near Australia. That's the maritime continent. So at that point, when that occurs, we're going to start to see more tropical systems coming out of the Atlantic, possibly into the Gulf of Mexico and along the East Coast. And what we'll ask about that time period is the Bermuda High opening here or is it opening there? And are there troughs sneaking through the United States? Because if the Bermuda High stays east and there are troughs in the west, this tends to be the setup that allows systems to just get into the Gulf or come into the southeast or roll up the east coast. It's when the Bermuda High is closer to Bermuda and we have troughs of low pressure that start in the west but don't get all the way to the east, right? So in other words, the flow comes over the top of it like this and they stay anchored in this area. That's what we're going to have to watch out for. Now, the map I've been drawing on here is the 10-day precipitation anomaly map. So we're just kind of looking at a few other places around the world to kind of keep an eye on. So take a look at parts of Australia as an example. Wet in places that really need to be getting this rainfall. Still quite wet in through here. A lot of precipitation around Shandong, the North China Plain, Manchurian Plain, Central Europe. But we do notice still drier in Ukraine and the Western Russian wheat belts showing up here. And looking down here at South America, still very much anchored in the dry season. We're going to be waiting on the monsoon to arrive. We talked a lot about that last week. But temperature-wise, a little bit warmer than normal down there. Still quite hot in Central Europe. We can see most of Australia warmer than average in this pattern as well. And the big question is going to be over the next 30 to 45 days, what will the very early progression of the planting progress be? If this map verifies, which goes out to September 21st, I don't imagine there'll be much early and aggressive planting. We'll be waiting more into October and the early part of November to see how quickly the crop's getting planted. So the new European model weeklies, taking me out to September 21st, are kind of, I think, falling better in line with the ideas I've had, which is that there's a large area of high pressure here now, and the flow is coming out and around like this and not down. So we're not able to draw on the higher humidity air here to get the monsoon started early. And that's why you see a drier than normal forecast through what could be, the first couple of weeks of planting in Brazil if the moisture's in place. So we'll start talking more and more about South America in each video as we get into their growing season. And with that, I think I'm going to stop it here. I'll talk to you again tomorrow morning. Have a good one. Thanks.